belonging to Blackness. Welcome to Season 6 of the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. India Lorik Wilmot. It's Caribbean Heritage Month. With us today is Edna Bonhomme, Haitian American scholar, writer, historian of science, culture writer, and book critic. She is the author of the new book, A History of the World in Six Plagues: How Contagion, Class, and Captivity Shaped Us from Cholera to COVID-19. Edna is also a contributing writer for Freeze magazine, the co-editor of the book After Sex, and her essays have appeared in Esquire, The Guardian, The Atlantic, London Review of Books, and The Nation, just to name a few. In addition to earning a PhD in History of Science from Princeton University, she's held fellowships from several institutes, including the Max Planck Institute, the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and Baldwin for the Arts, and awards from the Robert Silvers Foundation and the Andy Warhol Foundation. We are interested to learn what it's like to be Black in Germany as a Haitian American and explore the history of global pandemics to elucidate inhumane treatment of African descendants and the ways they are resistant, resilient, and relentless in their pursuit of surviving sickness and disease. A riveting and important topic. Welcome, Edna.
Thank you for having me.
We're looking forward to learning more about what it means to belong to Blackness for you. So are you ready?
Sure.
So let's get into it.
Give Black Alliance is proud to support the podcast Belonging to Blackness, hosted by India Lorik Wilmot. The podcast is an exploration of all aspects of our Black communities, including gifts of time, talent, and treasure, while shedding a positive light on the African descendant experience globally. The Give Black Alliance informs, reforms, and transforms philanthropy to acknowledge and partner with our communities in order to bring about equitable change for all. To learn more about Give Black Alliance, visit us at giveblackalliance.org.
Act 1. Call to Adventure. Often I say to my guests that much of what inspires us and gives us purpose is autobiographically rooted. So you grew up in South Florida, Miami, to Haitian immigrants, and you've shared how your own childhood illness at 4 years old, diagnosed with typhoid fever and then being hospitalized, has had a profound impact on the ways you would later write about illness, captivity, identity, and resiliency. So how has your family and upbringing inspired you to study and write on topics such as race, colonialism, and medical apartheid? And I'm thinking particularly about your current book, History of Six Plagues, and then also reproductive justice, as you've also written about in the anthology After Sex.
Thank you so much for that question. One thing I would say is that our personal histories, our identity can be a starting point for how we understand the world around us, but it in itself doesn't always define who we are. In fact, it is ways in which we interpret past events and also intergenerational trauma, or both in some cases, that influence the means by which we can move through the world. As someone of Haitian descent, as someone who has very much been part of a rich history, a history of resistance, I was always surrounded by stories, folklore, music that allowed me to get a sense that I, as an individual, am a product of both living and deceased ancestors in my lineage. But beyond that, as someone who also has engaged with psychoanalysis and so forth, I also know that the significance of the subconscious and my own lived experiences, especially in childhood, influence, impact who I am and what I'm inspired by. So all of that taken together, what I would say is that curiosity and wonder have been at the foundation of how I move through the world and what I intend to study, and has also enlivened my interest in the natural sciences as a whole, whether that be marine biology in middle school and high school, living in Miami, which is right next to the ocean, and seeing the wonder of the ocean and seeing coral reefs and mangroves, and try to understand how the tropical landscape or semi-tropical landscape was both beautiful and also protective. The kind of background that I had and the environment that I lived in helped to inspire me to think about science as not just an inquisitive and important subject, but something that I wanted to pursue personally. And as I came to study biology in undergrad, public health for my master's, and eventually getting a PhD, I was also struck by, in some cases, the lack of representation of Black people in some of these institutions, even thinking about how the questions that were often asked about people of African diaspora were kind of narrow in some cases or superficial, even just stories that felt like it was only about the struggles and trauma and not about the joy. And in my case, as someone who has a degree in the natural sciences, and as well as someone who is inspired by literature and the history of colonialism, I wanted to do more, and I wanted to really try to bridge the gap between the basics of understanding microorganisms and how to communicate that language to a broad audience, an audience that also includes people of the African diaspora, an audience that is also thinking deeply about theorists and philosophers who are Black, of Asian descent, Latinx, and so forth. I think that by virtue of asking deeper questions and trying to exercise nuance, it also compels me to consider, the legacy of colonialism, to look at people like Ami Césaire, who in the discourse of colonialism really pointed out that no one colonizes with impunity, and that a nation that colonizes, a civilization which justifies colonization, is a sick nation or a sick civilization. And for me, as someone who read that decades ago, I felt that I had to consider exactly what he said. What Europeans did to people on the African continent and the Caribbean was in itself a disease, and try to see how that has been perpetuated and has ultimately influenced the political structures we have today is something that I've been wanting to unfold. It is no accident that when we have certain forms of injustices and bigotry, such as colonialism and racism, that anti-feminist thoughts, misogyny also reign. And so trying to unpack what Kimberly Crenshaw has brilliantly theorized about intersectionality and seeing how these things play out in real time is part of what I try to do, not just in the book, but also in my writing more broadly.
So I appreciate you sharing with us those early passions, those things that really helped to inform your current thinking. You could have taken so many pathways, but you specifically decided to study the history of science. You could have been a practitioner, could have been a research scientist in the lab or out in the field doing some of the work, could have been someone like myself, a sociologist that looks at policies and so forth, but you specifically chose the history of science. How has writing, particularly within this discipline, served you both personally and professionally?
Yeah, excellent question. The history of science is such an exciting field because it isn't a static version of science as we understand it, or even just a modern or contemporary version of science. And the definition of what science is a dynamic and flexible category. Often when I was studying it, they also are referring to really the history of knowledge, people who are doing some form of observation and experimentation around the world. And to an extent, it can and has included the history of philosophy. A historian of science and philosopher, Thomas Kuhn, wrote extensively about this, thinking about the scientific paradigms and how they shift, and the ways that we can engage with understanding, who is Einstein and the special relativity and various people who were competing to understand the origins of the world and the universe, or in some cases, trying to understand the history of anthropologists in the 19th century. Some of it was tied to pseudoscience, or in some cases, thinking about the history of the bubonic plague outbreaks in Western Europe in the 14th century. All of this can be part of what we can consider to be history of science. And I, for my PhD, focused on the history of epidemics in North Africa and the Middle East. For me, it wasn't just an engagement about these outbreaks that were happening in the 18th and 19th centuries in places like Cairo and Tunis and so forth, but I was also thinking about how were people writing about it? How did plague operate and serve as a metaphor? What types of shifts and changes happened with respect to trade when there was an outbreak? What did memorial sites look like during an outbreak, and who was revered during this period? So I spent 2 years living in Cairo, going through the archives, as well as spending time in Tunis. For me, archival work was quite important, as well as interviewing people, going to physical sites, looking at the cemetery as an archive as well. And I try to be quite experimental in my method. But at the same time, I also felt like the discipline wasn't that much disconnected from Black scholars that I know. For example, Frantz Fanon once said, to speak a language is to take on a world and a culture. And Fanon is particularly remarkable. He was a Black Martinican psychoanalyst who was also part of the French Empire and found himself in Algeria as a colonial agent, but then siding with Algerians. It was in that process of being revolutionized in real time and seeing patients who were negatively impacted by colonialism, who were made sick psychologically by virtue of the French imposing a two-tiered system and settled a colonial state. He used his expertise as an analyst, as a scientist, as someone who also could see versions of himself within the context of these people who were fighting for their liberation, to put his philosophy onto paper. I've been inspired by Fanon into thinking that writing is also a way to speak and allow my language and my background to shape culture and society. Whether people are trained as conductors, janitors, composers, nurses, educators, I think it's important for us to generate and discover whatever mission we have to our full capacity. And while I've had a circuitous route in biology and public health and so forth, I do think that it's important to endlessly create myself through my writing, and by prying, making mistakes, in some cases, editing, re-editing, in some ways taking the chaos of the world and trying to find some order into it through composition and through interviewing people and figuring out what's going on. And it's not to say that there's a singular story and a singular narrative. If anything, I love and I appreciate that there are so many beautiful Black writers in literature and scholarship who are doing that work. Kai C. Lehman, Imani Perry, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, Laura Michelle Jackson at The New Yorker. And so people are doing that work. So we don't just have to look at Fanon to consider what this means, but also writers of the present.
There's a nice intersection of how you're playing through the literature, how you're looking through the research, and how it's informing, reforming, all the things that you're even doing as part of your own body of work. I think that's quite evident in your most recent book, A History of the World in Six Plagues. You're citing Baldwin, you have Audre Lorde, you have a host of other folks that represent a span of various traditions in there, right? So it's not purely scientific, it's not purely philosophical, but it's a nice marriage to draw on the things that people are really talking about. I appreciate that approach. So I'm going to pivot a little bit because you primarily live in Berlin, Germany. And so as a Black expat, what has the experience been like contending with the racial, ethnic, and nativity nuances of Blackness and womanness? You talk about this in the book, but for you specifically, in terms of what it means to view and see and live, witness the treatment of Black Germans and Black immigrants and refugees in public health.
Thank you for that question. It's a bit complicated to answer. I actually don't consider myself an expat.
Really?
More as a migrant because I migrated to Germany in 2017.
Speak more to that. What is the distinction that you're making? Because I've had folks who are saying, no, I'm an expat. It's more than just paperwork.
Absolutely. I don't want to impose an identity onto others that they don't agree with. And if someone wants to identify as an expat, that's perfectly fine. For myself, the terminology expat is loaded with many historical identities that I may not necessarily always agree with. So the quintessential expat in the 1920s and 30s, American one that is, who's in Europe, in some cases, particularly if they weren't Black, probably didn't try to learn the language and the new and adopted country in some cases, often had a certain privilege and access to resources and a certain kind of capital. Their time there was perhaps limited to the cultural elites or maybe even just economic elites within a European country, Paris, London, wherever. Beyond that, I think that the term, the pat, suggests patriotism for the country that you were in beforehand, which I don't have. I am not patriotic to the United States of America, where I was born and raised. In fact, I have a lot of criticism, hence the reason I left. I see myself more as a migrant because I want to have more solidarity and affinity with other people who migrate, whatever reason they do, whether or not they come from a global north country or a global south country, and to present myself as trying to find ways to create and build community in as much of a democratic and horizontal way as possible. I have found, and I'm not saying everyone who takes on that category, that the expat can feel like it's excluding oneself from a broader and larger diaspora community of people who may be in a new country for whatever reason. To an extent, and this opens up to your broader question, there is a legacy of African Americans whose work I admire, whether it's James Baldwin, Josephine Baker, Afro-Caribbean people such as Claude McKay, who end up in Europe, or even Claudia Jones, who is Trinidadian and went to the US and then ended up in London. There is a sense of connection, a different type of connection to their Blackness by virtue of being abroad, and that all of those people had some form of cultural capital that gave them access to white Europeans in a sense and led to different forms of success. And with Baldwin, he even said, I'm an American writer and my subject is my country. There was a point where he would come back to the United States, not just to spend time with family and friends, but to really get a sense of how this place shaped who he was. And I think that Baldwin, in a sense, could succeed by virtue of being distant from the United States. Similar thing with Josephine Baker as well. I think for me, what I'm contending with while living in Germany is that Germany as a country is still dealing with what it means to relate to Black people of the African diaspora. The Berlin Conference, which happened in 1884, 1885, popularly known as the Scramble for Africa, is where Europeans convened to decide, without the consultation of Africans, how the continent would be carved out and ruled by Europeans. And Germany benefited from that by having colonies in what is now present-day Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and so forth. There were Black people from the continent who, in some cases, ended up living in Germany, even well before colonization and afterwards, not in the same numbers as in the United States. So it could be easy for an average German person to be like, well, we're not a nation in which Black people really lived here in large masses. Because of that, there can be at times anti-Blackness. There can be at times, especially when they compare themselves to Britain and Britain's long colonial history, that they don't see themselves as a colonial power. They didn't see themselves as having a major colonial impact, when in fact it was quite central to the African colonial process. So given that in the present day situation, one of the things I find exciting about living in Berlin, and there are Black people who live in Hamburg and have been for decades, Black communities in Munich and Frankfurt. But in the Berlin context, which I'm most familiar with, young Black folk creating organizations, forming teach-ins, having demonstrations. Audre Lorde spent time in Berlin during the 80s and was a mentor to Maya Ayim, Afro-German poet, as well as helping to create an Afro-German feminist organization that is still in existence today. And I've gone to some of their meetings and know some of the elders of that organization. There's a vibrancy to what is happening as people born and raised in Germany and are Black inspire me all the time, as well as Africans who have moved to Germany for all kinds of reasons and are also figuring out what their place is in a country that may resist and deny their autonomy and presence. And for me, as a US American Black person, I think my role is to try to also listen and to understand and appreciate these other identities, migration stories, and not to center myself. And this is where I would critique some of the African Americans who might have identified as expats 80, 90 years ago in Europe, is that they didn't always form community with the Africans or Black born Europeans who are living in the continent. And I don't have all the answers, but I'm still working through that and figuring out how to best be in solidarity with the many forms of Blackness that exist in Germany.
Thank you for your own personal clarification between being an expat versus being a migrant. What I'm hearing you emphasize is solidarity and building community, but perhaps there's a critique around being an expat. You're still kind of outsider insider. You see yourself as more than that. I am engaging in some form of acculturation. I am embedding myself within the community. I'm learning the language. I am participating in very distinct ways. You have a different kind of sensibility. I'm presuming that there is another level of awareness because you are coming with a host of other kinds of capital, because you are a Haitian American immigrant raised in the US. And so now you're transposing some of that into this particular context and framing.
Yes, I have cultural capital and social capital, but no material capital. That's a clear distinction. The actual capital is lacking. And this is the part that is complicated. No one knows I'm Haitian or what Haitian means or Haiti means. Even people on the African continent who I will encounter, and I'll be like, my family's from Haiti. They're like, what? Like, and they're just not aware. Or people don't accept that I'm not from a specific country on the African continent. And so I'm just like, I'm sorry, but there is this thing. And then I go into slavery, it's clavage. And I've had to talk about this in multiple languages. And even then, it's so complicated. So I get misidentified in a way that I have never been in the US. And so the Haitian part of me basically disappears in the consciousness of people because it's not fully recognizable. And there's this desire by people to just place me to a specific country on the African continent. And by virtue of historical forces from hundreds of years ago, I can't. It's been interesting to have those discussions and debates in Germany, of all places, and to realize also that the types of histories that I knew growing up, I felt was universal, is not necessarily something that people know across the pond. There are also histories and specificities of ethnic group tensions and so forth on the continent, Fulani versus Wolof people versus Igbo versus Yoruba, that I've come to learn about by virtue of living in Germany. My ignorance, some of it has actually had to be elided because I am meeting in person someone that is not just African in quotes, but someone who's like, no, actually I'm Igbo, or I am Yoruba and proud, and this is my many languages that I speak. And I think that that's the thing I love about the messiness of trying to work through people's Blackness in Germany in ways that doesn't happen in the US.
We have listeners in now almost 85 countries worldwide, right? And so they represent and have different kinds of understandings and experiences of what Blackness is, what that means to them, germane to their own socio-political, economic context of the country in which they're in and listening from. If anything, it just further confirms the idea that the Black global experience across the diaspora is one that's not a monolith. And our context helps to inform these experiences and our own understanding. But I want us to talk a little bit more about the book, how you chose to approach the research and writing of A History of the World in Six Plagues. The book covers 6 plagues. You focus on cholera, particularly around maternal mortality, colonial plantation context, influenza, the sleeping sickness, Ebola, HIV/AIDS, and COVID-19. What was your methodology for selecting these plagues?
Toni Morrison once said that I wrote the first book because I wanted to read it. And that's precisely how I felt that I wanted to write a book that I haven't necessarily seen written by someone like myself, one that is not just a pure descriptive history of epidemics and outbreaks, or even just a general history of science, but something that allows us to step into episodic cases of outbreaks in ultimately the contemporary and modern period. The outbreaks that I focus on and the specific times that they occurred are all tied to some form of confinement and captivity. So I look at cholera in the plantation, sleeping sickness, a disease that causes lethargy. If left untreated, it can cause death, was an epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa in the 19th, early 20th century. Ebola, flu, COVID-19, all of these outbreaks happened at different scales, in some cases regional, and obviously the most recent COVID being a global phenomenon. And part of what I wanted to capture is how certain individuals experience the tail end of the outbreak, how people try to escape it somehow, how people wrote about it, but also how people found refuge in whatever way that they could, or resisting the different forms of confinement. And I think that part of what was for me interesting as a historian is to be creative about the archive. So, for example, for the flu chapter, where I focus a lot on Virginia Woolf, I went to the Berg archives and collections at the New York Public Library. For the Robert Koch chapter on sleeping sickness, the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin is the state library, and his papers are there. And in other cases, I read through primary scientific literature, in some cases written by some of the subjects. So in the HIV/AIDS chapter, I focus a lot on Kathy Bowden, as well as the ACE program, which was a mutual aid caring program that was developed by incarcerated women at Bedford Hills. And this group of women wrote a book, and they also wrote from prison peer-reviewed public health articles about their program. And so I try to be creative about the source material because I wanted to give voice to people who may not necessarily be squarely based in the archive. And so that meant that I had to expand the types of sources and the methodology and the writing process. Trying to choose and think about these cases, I thought that it was important to highlight cases that people didn't often know about, or maybe they thought they knew, and to really expand on it from a different perspective. There has been heaps written about COVID, for example. By 2020, 2021, you had people writing COVID books. So Adam Tooze, Michael Lewis, and so forth. These were people who were writing more journalistic style of writing around this. Or even if we think about the history of medical apartheid, Washington's work on this is excellent. Dorothy Roberts, Killing the Black Body, Deidre Owens, his Medicalizing Blackness. The literature is vast, it's important, and it's relevant, and it's what has inspired me to compose a book. But I wanted to turn to what Toni Morrison said, is like, I wanted to write my type of book, a book that I haven't seen yet, and to really develop it from a perspective that is not just about US America, but really thinking about the complications of global inequalities and their aftermath, imperialism, and how that impacts people's health by virtue of living in a place where I'm constantly in conversations about identity and place and what is missing. I wanted to find the space and the time to really pinpoint how these outbreaks can cause people to really feel quite vulnerable. And the book is, on the one hand, a history of people who suffered, and to some extent, but not just. Like, it's also a history of people who tried to make peace with their environment and find some way to be better and do better.
One of the things that you've done is really around showcasing how humans, in their response to plague and their treatment of illnesses in so many different ways, mirror society's structure. The current understandings and practices around race, class, and colonialism, right? So it makes sense when you start off in talking about cholera and maternal mortality that you start with our plantation system. Here in the United States, African descendants on the plantations were trying to subvert some of the efforts that were imposed upon them through some of the doctors of the time who was trying to study and come up with solutions that really weren't great forms of treatment to begin with. Through the chronology that you provide to us about the plagues, you get to see just what was informing research, science, and medicine at the time, and then people's response and resistance. And I couldn't help but think, isn't there another plague in here? Isn't there really a seventh plague? Should we consider racism a plague upon a plague?
Absolutely. Short answer.
Yes, done.
Yeah, short answer, yeah. Well, first of all, I gave birth last year, and one of the things that I have learned from that process is that people are born inherently good and curious and open and so forth. The joy that a young baby has when they're just starting to develop consciousness about the world beyond themselves is quite beautiful. No one is born racist, and that's something that I see with this baby and seeing other babies of friends and so forth. I bring that up just to say that racism is a learned practice, and it's a learned practice that we unfortunately need to figure out how to get rid of, diagnose and be honest about the diagnosis, and then somehow treat it. I don't necessarily have an answer for how to treat it on a societal level or even on an individual level. I think that part of what's difficult, especially in this moment in which there's a rightward shift, not just in the United States, but also in Western Europe for sure, in Germany where I live, in Hungary, the Netherlands, and so forth. Far right parties have taken up popularity in a way that will be dangerous, not just in the short term, but for the long term. And I think a lot of it is racism, and racism, not just to people African descended or Black, but a lot of it is also anti-Arab, anti-Muslim as well. And in the European context, I would say that on an everyday level, interpersonal interaction, it is taboo to make anti-Black comments. However, it is perfectly acceptable in the German context to make pejorative comments towards Muslims. People justify it and equate their comments as being anti-culture, like all kinds of things. I'm still really flabbergasted by this phenomenon. And so it is a disease, but it doesn't mean that we don't challenge it. And it doesn't mean that if one group is being marginalized, and if I'm not part of that ethnic group, racial group, whatever, religious group, that I don't stand up for those people. In fact, if anything, that's even more of a reason to do so and to exercise a moral backbone. And this is something that I'm just learning on a personal level and a political level, that if we want to really challenge bigotry and anti-racism, we can't give bigots an inch because they'll take a mile. As a anti-capitalist, I would say that I like the 60s and the 70s during periods of international movements, the Bantu Conference, where people were organizing and seeing each other as comrades, so like Indonesians in conversations with Kenyans, African Americans in conversation with Algerians. And we're not there. Like, it's a new age where maybe people feel a bit more fragmented in how they communicate about their struggles. I think what's missing is the internationalism that really made people feel like they had more in common.
Belonging to Blackness, proudly sponsored by Get Connected. Get Connected is a nationally recognized premier cross-cultural and inclusive business networking organization for professionals, business, and civic leaders, entrepreneurs from all cultures across industries and sectors. Our mission is to curate meaningful cross-cultural business and social connections while amplifying, celebrating, documenting, and showcasing the contributions of people of color and allies across our communities. To learn more, visit us at www.getconnected.com.
to the road. So, Edna, because of the heaviness of the topics you explore in your writings, I presume finding opportunities for experiencing joy and engaging in any form of resistance would be important to your own well-being. So, how do you play?
Play has been interesting because I barely get any sleep after having had a child. So I'm a bit sleep deprived. But one of the things that I would say has also come from the space of sleep deprivation is that a young child, once they start to get a sense of themselves and the world, needs to be entertained. So I have to be creative and do things like peekaboo, making funny noises, reading with enthusiasm, and just learning to have a certain lightness. So play in a very basic sense has basically meant being a parent that's trying to entertain a little young person. And it's fun. It's cool. It's something that I'm still figuring out. I'm not one of those parents that has all the answers or is just like, this is so easy and fun. I'm making mistakes all the time, but it's okay. It's a journey of figuring out who I am in relation to this new person.
That's beautiful. You know that I'm a sociologist and that I focus on race and inequality, among a host of other topics. And so, with that analytical lens through which I read your book, I enjoyed how it provides a critical look at plagues and then specifically on marginalized people, particularly African and African descendant populations across time. Themes around captivity and isolation, medical scientific experimentation, all being against the backdrop of, say, eugenics and deep politics, international politics, particularly when we cross the Atlantic Ocean and you're focusing on Ebola, you're talking about sleep sickness, AIDS, and framing what that disease means in terms of contagion and contamination of other populations as they're framing it within their own political frameworks. How do you think your historical analysis of the treatment of disease will inform contemporary discussions on global health inequities?
One of the things I hope the book will do is to enliven people to be curious about a world beyond themselves. I say that because whether it's myself or anyone else, we still have a lot to learn about the body, disease, and so forth. Science is such a discipline that is so many disciplines, actually. If we think about everything from microbiology to quantum mechanics to special relativity, it can feel as if the people who are experts are writing for themselves, but actually it's something that should be part of our everyday lives. What does it mean for us to understand germ theory and who were the people who helped us think about how microorganisms impact and influence disease? Who are the major scientists and astrophysicists that have given us a sense of like what a black hole is? And well, beyond that, how do we actually deal with outbreaks? And how do people understand what is happening around them? And how do public health officials communicate and articulate what a disease is so that people understand why there are certain measures being put into place to begin with. The reason I talk about epidemics is because they're kind of a state of exception, or they feel like a state of exception from our normal everyday lives, because it can feel as if the outbreak can impact anyone. The fear and anxiety that can come from that, yeah, it's quite difficult to reckon with. And so ultimately, I want people to understand that we all have a lot to learn, and how do we build from that? In each of these chapters, I try to exercise a bit of grace. I try to see, okay, well, how did the most marginalized people cope with an outbreak? And how could society do a bit better to accommodate for them? Beyond that, at least in the US context, why don't we have a national healthcare system? Coming out of the pandemic, at a very bare minimum, one of the major lessons that should have been learned is like there needs to be a national healthcare system where everyone has access to universal healthcare, no matter their income, ethnic background, whatever, so that if there is another outbreak, people are taken care of, and the resources are there, that nurses, doctors, janitorial staff in medical centers and clinics are paid adequately, and that people don't have to go very far so that they can build trust in medicine. The funding, the resources really need to be redistributed on a mass scale. There is, right at this moment, a kind of rise in vaccine skepticism, not just in the United States, but also in Western Europe. And a lot of that has to do with the mistrust that has been built over the past couple decades between democratic societies and some of its more rightward citizens. What would it mean to have like open debates and conversations so that the trust can actually be rebuilt, so that people understand various mechanisms of scientific principles and that they're able to feel that they have a say in that through teach-ins, public forums, and so forth. Ultimately, the book is also making a case for us to be more proactive and having a foundation in which everyone has far more access to health resources than they currently do, whether or not they live in Detroit, Kampala, or Baku.
I really enjoyed how you made it very human in that chapter called Relentless, in terms of highlighting the experiences of three women. You have these women in particular to say what it's like to have to go through systems of care when you are trying to survive cancer and thrive. The status around what it means to be a sex worker. You were able to capture how they're like, look, this is what I'm actually going through. The humanness around focusing on these stories and their demonstration of resilience, how they engaged in smaller forms of resistance that made sense for their context. I appreciate that. Spelling this out for folks to really see the humanness.
Thank you for holding space for that. One thing I would say that inspired that chapter is just what I was reading in the news in March, April, and May of 2020, how African Americans were more susceptible to getting and or dying from COVID. And this was being repeated over and over again without nuance and without clarity as to why and what that actually meant. Later, we would find out that some of the reasons weren't anything to do with biology or physical structure of what it means to be Black. And one cannot make these claims without giving a reason. And recycling these data and statistics without the other context kind of felt a bit empty to me. And so later people would find out, well, actually, African Americans in some cases were more disproportionately doing essential work. They were essential workers and workers who had more social contact and weren't always able to do social distancing. So there's something about the type of labor that people are disproportionately having access to, and that is making them more vulnerable. Or in some cases, people who are incarcerated. Well, racism and the structural issues around the incarceration system and mass incarceration impacted people's likelihood, again, not to have social distancing, more susceptible to the disease. I wanted to have a COVID chapter and write about what was happening to Black people in a way that wasn't just they're getting it for these reasons, they're susceptible because of some social barrier, but to really do the work that can sometimes be quite useful in ethnography, spend time getting to speak to people, getting their thoughts and really building trust with them so that one can see the layers and the humanity behind Black people. That is ultimately what I wanted to do. Basically, over a period of a year and a half, 2 years from the time that the COVID lockdown began, and 2 years later, I would call, email, and contact about 5 people living in Germany and just ask them, how are they doing? So that chapter focuses on 3 out of those 5 people with whom I maintain contact: a sex worker, a cancer survivor, and an asylum seeker, someone who's a refugee, all living in Germany. And part of what you see in that chapter is just them making sense of this new reality, the community they live in, who they are in Germany. And it's about COVID, but it really is about surviving and trying to figure out what life might mean and look like. My anger about the misrepresentation or shallowness of representation of Black people inspired me to think of how to give us a bit more texture and dimension.
Act 3, Where We Land. So, Edna, your book dropped about a month, 2 months ago, A History of the World in Six Plagues. For folks who are interested after listening to this episode, where can they find you? Are there particular upcoming events, speaking engagements, things that you are doing to promote this book? Please tell us what's happening.
So the best way to find out about what I'm doing is by going to my website, www.ednabonhomme.com. That's EDNABONHOMME.com. I also have a Substack newsletter, bonhomme.substack.com. I'm on Instagram with Bonhomme, BONHOMME. I'm still on Twitter. That name is Jacobinoir, so it's JACOBINOIRE. So the website's the easiest. And then if you join my newsletter, I also tell people what I've written recently, as well as what I'm up to or what I'm going to be doing.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Edna Bonhomme, for joining us here on Belonging to Blackness.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and be sure to subscribe. Find us on my website, www.indialoricwilmot.com. Follow us on IG and Facebook at belongingtoblackness_podcast for the latest fashion and accessories. Visit www.shopbelongingtoblackness.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.